"I don't sing in public," Dorothy Mae Henderson protested as Ray Charles pointed directly at her from the stage of Chicago Theater in 1974. The 60-year-old retired music teacher had been enjoying the concert quietly from the 12th row, never imagining that her evening out with her husband Harold would turn into the most terrifying and transformative moment of her life. For 35 years, Dorothy had taught children how to sing, how to read music, how to find their voices and express themselves through melody. But she had never, not once, performed in front of an audience larger than her own classroom. "Come on up here, beautiful lady," Ray Charles called out, his voice carrying that unmistakable charm that had melted hearts for decades. "I can tell you've got music in you." Dorothy shook her head frantically, her face flushing red as 15,000 people turned to look at her. She grabbed Harold's arm desperately, but her husband of 40 years just smiled and gently nudged her toward the aisle. "Go on, Dot," Harold whispered. "You've been hiding that voice long enough." But to understand why Harold's words carried such weight, and why Ray Charles would make a decision that would change both their lives forever, you need to know about the secret Dorothy had been keeping for 4 decades, a secret that not even her own students had ever discovered. It was April 15, 1974, at the historic Chicago Theater, and Ray Charles was in the middle of his Renaissance tour, performing intimate shows in smaller venues where he could connect more personally with his audiences. The Chicago Theater, with its ornate architecture and perfect acoustics, was exactly the kind of venue where magic could happen unexpectedly. Dorothy Mae Henderson had never intended to attend the concert at all. At 60, she had convinced herself that her music listening days were behind her, that concerts were for young people who still had dreams to chase. But Harold had surprised her with tickets for their 40th wedding anniversary, insisting that the woman who had dedicated her life to music deserved to hear it performed by one of the greatest artists of their time. "I'm too old for concerts," Dorothy had protested when Harold presented the tickets. "What will people think of 2 old folks like us at a Ray Charles show? They'll think we're smart enough to appreciate good music," Harold had replied with the gentle firmness that had characterized their 4-decade marriage. Dorothy's relationship with music was complicated. She had discovered her love for singing at age 8, when her grandmother had caught her humming along to the radio while washing dishes. "Child, you've got something special in that voice," her grandmother had said. "Don't you let anyone tell you different." But Dorothy had grown up in the 1930s, when a young woman's options were limited, especially a young woman from a working-class family in rural Illinois. Her parents had been supportive of her musical interests as a hobby, but when it came time for college, they steered her toward teaching, a practical career that would allow her to use her musical knowledge while providing a stable income. "Music is a wonderful thing to know about," her father had told her, "but it's not something you can count on to put food on the table." So Dorothy had become a music teacher, spending 35 years nurturing other people's voices, while keeping her own carefully hidden. She had told herself that it was enough to help children discover their musical gifts, that her role was to be the facilitator, not the performer. But deep down, in the quiet moments when she was alone in her classroom after school, she sometimes wondered what might have been if she had been brave enough to pursue her own dreams. Harold knew about Dorothy's hidden talent because he had been listening to her sing for 40 years, while she cooked dinner, while she graded papers, while she thought no one was paying attention. He had heard the richness and depth in her voice, the natural vibrato that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her soul, the way she could make even the simplest melody sound like a prayer. "Why don't you sing in the church choir?" Harold had asked her countless times over the years. "I'm just a teacher," Dorothy would always reply. "My job is to help others shine, not to seek attention for myself." Now, as Ray Charles stood on the stage of the Chicago Theater, something in Dorothy's posture, something in the way she moved slightly to his music, had caught his attention. Ray had performed for thousands of audiences over his career, and he had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense musical talent in his listeners. "Ma'am," Ray said, his voice gentle but insistent, I can see you know music, I can tell by the way you're listening. Come up here and share some of that knowledge with all of us." Dorothy stood up reluctantly, her hands shaking as she made her way down the aisle toward the stage. The audience watched curiously, as this ordinary-looking woman in a modest blue dress climbed the steps to meet Ray Charles. Some people whispered among themselves, wondering what Ray had seen that they had missed. "What's your name, darling?" Ray asked as Dorothy reached the piano. "Dorothy Henderson," she replied, her voice barely audible. "Dorothy, tell me about yourself. What do you do?" "I'm a retired music teacher," Dorothy said, her voice growing slightly stronger. "I taught elementary school for 35 years. 35 years of teaching music," Ray repeated, his respect evident in his voice. "That means you've helped hundreds of children find their voices. That's beautiful work." Dorothy nodded, feeling some of her nervousness ease at Ray's genuine appreciation for her career. "Now, Dorothy," Ray continued, "I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to trust me. Will you sing something for us?" "Oh no," Dorothy said immediately, stepping back. "I couldn't. I don't perform. I teach." "But who taught the teacher?" Ray asked with a smile. "Dorothy, you've spent 35 years encouraging children to be brave, to share their gifts. Don't you think it's time you took your own advice?" The audience was completely silent, sensing that something significant was happening on stage. Dr. Patricia Williams, a music professor at Northwestern University, who was sitting in the 5th row, leaned forward with professional interest. She had attended the concert hoping to hear Ray Charles at his best, but now she found herself curious about this retired teacher, who seemed so reluctant to share whatever Ray had recognized in her. "I wouldn't know what to sing," Dorothy said, but her protest sounded weaker than before. "Sing something you love," Ray suggested, "something that means something to you." Dorothy stood quietly, for a moment, her mind racing through decades of songs she had taught, melodies that had sustained her through good times and bad. Then, almost without realizing it, she began to hum a few bars of "Summertime." "That's beautiful," Ray said encouragingly. "Why don't you sing it for us?" "I can't," Dorothy whispered. "I'm not good enough." "Dorothy," Ray said, his voice carrying a gravity that silenced every person in the theater. "Let me tell you something I've learned in my years of making music. The most beautiful voices aren't always the ones that have been trained in conservatories or polished on stages. Sometimes the most beautiful voices are the ones that have been seasoned by life, tempered by humility, and strengthened by service to others." He gestured toward the audience. "These people didn't come here tonight just to hear me sing. They came here to experience music, to feel something real. And you, Dorothy Henderson, have something real to offer." Dorothy looked out at the 15,000 faces watching her, and for the first time in her life, she saw not judgment, but anticipation, not criticism, but encouragement. These weren't students evaluating their teacher. These were fellow human beings waiting to share in whatever gift she might have to offer.